Welcome to Redbeard Radio. I'm Brian Keith. And if you've noticed, the economy is weird. And it doesn't matter what year you're listening to this episode, the economy is always weird in that what we expect to happen next is not always what happens next. Sometimes we expect things to be going along just the same or getting a lot better. And then something happens, something unexpected happens. It could have been the pandemic for you. It could have been something where the market you expected to be there just suddenly isn't there. We're talking today with Charles Gaudet of PredictableProfits.com about what to do when that unexpected thing happens and the economy does not turn out how you'd hoped. You heard Charles on episode 26 of Redbeard Radio talking about what he learned at the Army War College, and you heard him on episode 34 on how to go beyond seven figures. You may have also heard me on Charles' podcast, the Beyond Seven Figures podcast. So if you want to go beyond seven figures, make sure to check that out. So today, talking about what to do when the economy is going south, we have Charles Gaudet. Welcome back to Redbeard Radio.
I love being on this show. Thank you for having me for the third time now. This is
Well,
awesome.
I love having you, Charlie, because you have been inside a lot of companies, and some of the time you've been working inside all the various folks you do business coaching for. You've been inside them during bull markets when everything is going great. And the question is, how can we go find more ad money because we're making some incredible return on ad spend? And the only question is, hey, get more money, throw it at more ads. We're making money everywhere. But then sometimes you've been in companies where the answer is, who are we going to fire this week to avoid going bankrupt? And that's a reality that who knows what 2022, which is the year that we're recording this, what it's going to look like the rest of the year. But a lot of us have not been in business during a really serious recession. And so I'm curious what you found, and especially when you're building your own companies, what does Charles Gaudet think about when you're thinking about building a recession-proof company?
So that's a really great question. And, I do have the context of, I was an entrepreneur in 2000 when we had the dot-com bubble, in 2001 when we had the 9/11 crisis, in 2008 when we had the financial crisis, and 2020, obviously with COVID. And then we started seeing the shift going on in the economy in December. And that's when we really started talking about it. And then I had flown out to Mexico to meet with a bunch of entrepreneurs and talking about it. And I think for context, what's really important for people to understand is that it's never a matter of a good economy or a bad economy. It's only just a different economy because people are still buying. It's just that they've become a lot more discerning. They're a lot more careful. For starters, they want to know, why should I even buy whatever the product or service is? Not necessarily from you, just in general. Let's say, for example, you have an SEO agency. The prospect is saying, why should I even invest in SEO? Or with the money that I have allocated, should I invest in pay-per-click or social media or direct mail or whatever it might be? And then once they make the decision, okay, I'm going to invest in SEO, then it's like, well, why should I do business with you rather than any of your customers? What makes you unique? What makes you better? And then once they make the decision and put you on the short list, it's how are you going to justify your cost? You never want to compete on price. Ideally, you want to be the most expensive competitor in the industry and still have people lining up to do business with you. Mm-hmm. So how are you going to justify that cost, that premium expense? I think it's also important to understand that in good economies, because consumers are a lot less discerning, in good economies that, your competition is largely going to be the people who you already know you're competing up against. If you're an SEO agency, it's going to be other SEO agencies. If you're a personal injury attorney, it's going to be other personal injury attorneys, and the list goes on and on. However, in a changing down economy, so to speak, because I really don't want to use the term bad, in a down economy, your competition is going to be anybody that's looking for that dollar. If I have $1 to spend, it's anybody that's trying to get access to that $1. So your competition has gotten a lot bigger. And so when you are positioning your product or service, you need to position it so that people understand that you are a must-have and not a nice-to-have. And that even goes with your existing customer base. Because when the markets turn, as they have, the first thing they look at all of their money that they're spending. They go to tighten their belt. And the first thing they slash are, what are all my nice-to-have expenses? All the nice-to-have, items that I'm buying on a regular basis, whatnot. I'm going to slash all the nice-to-have. because it's time to buckle down. And then they look at their must have as the last thing that they want to cancel. But should they have to cancel their must haves, then they're going to prioritize it based on the impact of their must have.
I have this routine that I go through on a regular basis, probably not regularly enough, where I pull out every subscription I have for my business and I categorize them. So things like Libsyn, where my podcast lives, unless it 100x in price, I'm never canceling Libsyn, right? That'd be a
Sure.
disaster. I'm never canceling Keep that I actually send out emails through, process payments through, etc. But then there's some other tools where I think, am I really using that? Could I get away with canceling it? And that idea of could I get away with canceling it is what we're talking about here. How do you make sure that you're not in that bucket of, maybe when someone asks themselves that about your service?
Well, it's really about a message market match, and how do you match the message of your product or service with what the market is thinking. Now, of course, when people think, well, must have, they automatically start thinking in terms of, well, you must have, well, you just mentioned Libsyn, right? Well, I must have that because it would be such an inconvenience to
Mm-hmm.
then disconnect and then try to find something else. You're either going to do your podcast or not do your podcast and so forth. And as long as you commit to doing your podcast, then Libsyn is a must-have. But then you got to look at some of the other items that people just don't automatically assume with must-haves. Apple launched one of the most expensive iPhones or smartphones rather than the market had ever seen. Back in the 2008 recession. And an iPhone by itself, I mean, isn't really a must-have. It is kind of a nice to have. But the way that Apple positioned it is they talked about the importance of having a smartphone, because you really don't want a dumb phone. You want a smartphone.
Mm-hmm.
And they talked about how your life will be so much better with a smartphone. It'll be so much more productive. You'll actually be more of the envy of your friends and your peer group or whatnot. And so literally it took people from, who had barely enough money to pay their electric bills and put food on the table, that they managed to find the money, camp out blocks away from the Apple store, just waiting their turn to be able to get their iPhone right off the bat instead of maybe waiting 2 or 3 days to get it later when they didn't have to get in line, because it was a must-have. Now, I think it's also important for our listeners to understand that people always have money for the things that are important to them. And the first time I realized that lesson is I went down on some volunteer work down in the Appalachian region down south. It's one of the poorest areas in America. And I decided I would go down and I would help support by repairing their houses and all this other stuff to give back a little bit. And this was back when I was in high school. And so I went down and I was just astonished by the level of poverty. And one of the first things that we did is we held a picnic for all the kids in the community to come in and get some food and whatnot, some entertainment. And there was this girl that came in. She's not that much older, around the same age as my daughter now. So she was about 8 years old or whatnot, clearly aware at this point of her unique body parts and so forth. And she came to this event and she wasn't wearing any shoes and she wasn't wearing a shirt. And I was like, you have got to be kidding me. So I went into my bag and I grabbed a t-shirt and I gave it to the girl. And I was just like, this is crazy. My gosh, they're so poor. They can't even afford shirts for their little girls. And that was really just it. I mean, if you got a heart beating in your chest, you felt it. It was just, because you could just tell there was this awkwardness, and she was embarrassed. So then the next day rolls around and I have to do work on these people's houses. And it was, as we start driving through the neighborhoods, I started looking at different things, especially now that I know that, wow, some people are so broke that they can't even afford shirts for their little girls. And I'm like, but wait a minute. There's, fairly decent cars in the driveway. In other words, they're not rust boxes. I mean, they're fairly decent. Most of these homes have above ground pools. Almost all of them have big satellite dishes on the roof. And I'm like, wait a minute. I started getting irate. If you can afford an above ground pool and you can afford a satellite dish, why the heck are you not clothing your children?
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm so irritated. My face is beet red. I go storming into the office. I'm like, do you know how much money I had to raise to be here? Do you know blah blah? And this is what's going on. And then these kids, and this is a giant waste, and they don't have clothes. And the head person said something to me I'll never forget. And he said, people always have the money for the things that are most important to them. Sadly, the children were just not important to them. Sadly. But the point is, even in the poorest areas of the world, or in America rather, like people can find the money for the things that are most important to them. Now, obviously, there's some exceptions and whatnot, but it was just a lesson that really stuck with me. We saw that with Apple. They found the money, even though many of these people had no reason to be buying these phones. And so, even in a down economy, if you know that you can fundamentally improve somebody's life, improve somebody's business, improve somebody's relationships, whatever that is, I believe you have a moral and ethical obligation to do whatever is possible to help them get access to your product or service, especially if you can make a big impact into their lives.
That is an incredible story and the second longest time I have ever stayed silent on my podcast in 160 something episodes.
You must have wondered where the heck I was going with it.
Oh, man. Well, no, I've seen it. I've seen it where I have many more times than once been around somewhere and looked at something that there's a level of consumption and thought, wow, that's so weird. And that's just because of my understanding of the relationship between how much you're producing and how much you're consuming is just different than some people, where they have this different set of priorities. And it's like, oh, these people have a different set of priorities about what matters. Where I might be driving a much older truck than someone who is, they have something new, but it's just different worlds that we're living in. But let me ask you this. A lot of us have grown up where, like, I started my business in 2012. Okay. So, well, I'd been around in various businesses before then. That was when it was now my thing. From 2012 on through till the excitement, fun, and games of 2020, I had never had that moment where something external happened and suddenly in February-ish of 2020, half my business went poof. The client's like, well, bye, right? And don't blame them. It was a very challenging time. And I look at that and I think, okay, I've learned, and just talking about me here, I've learned all kinds of habits and ways of thinking about business that to some extent are in sunny days on green pastures. And you're talking about, oh, well, here's what happened in 2000, 2001, 2008. So you have a different perspective on and some of these truths. And I wonder, how is it that, let's call them soft, untested entrepreneurs who maybe been around for a decade, but only lived through one downturn, someone like you who's been through something like 4 plus, how do you, I guess, what am I missing is sort of my question. What do I not understand? And I get that the only way you understand it is by living through it. So it's not like I can just borrow Charlie's brain from 2008. But I'm curious, what can those of us do who started our businesses, I guess, after '08? How can we go just get our brains ready to go for having that kind of resiliency to survive these downturns?
That's a great question, Brian. So I was in South Africa many years ago, and I'm having dinner with these two guys. One guy uh, is Cuban, and he literally came in off the boat with his family illegally into the country, and made his way in and so forth. And another guy came. His parents scrambled together like $38 or whatnot, flew him from Poland over to America. They're both Americans, but we happen to be eating together in South Africa. And when the bill came, they both flashed their black cards. So I realized they had infinite amount of cash and very, very successful. Um, and so I asked them about their stories. And what they ultimately ended up saying is that when they came to the country, they believed that anybody in America could make $1 million. And no matter what anybody else said, they were raised that it was so easy to make $1 million that the guy from Cuba made his first million within a year of getting his first job and his first job was packing groceries in a grocery store. He basically packed groceries, walked out to a woman's car. She had a Mercedes. He assumed she had $1 million and asked her what she did. And then he started the same business and he made his $1 million within the first year. So I know it was crazy.
Wow.
And the other gentleman, his story was very similar. So I bring this up because one of the things that I learned is the power of our mindset. And it's funny because even with all the podcast episodes that I've done on the Beyond Seven Figures podcast, the percentage of people who have attributed mindset to the reason why they're so successful is off the charts. But when 2020 happened, it was something that impacted everybody. And regardless of the industry, and I'm talking travel industry, restaurant industry, we have clients from all over the place. When we got on the phone, I said, "Why is now the best time in the world for you to be in business?" And they're like, "Wait, what?" I said, No. Why is now the best time in the world for you to be in business?" And until I could get them to start talking about why now could be the best time in the world for them to be in business, we weren't going to go any further. And that's because we all have, you've heard the phrase rose-colored glasses before, right, Brian?
Yeah.
So we all have our own sort of rose-colored glasses. If we talk about a bad economy and all the business that we're losing and the people that are undercutting us and all this other stuff, we're only going to be seeing more and more things to support that belief that things are bad and things are terrible and so forth. And we're going to continue going in that direction because money flows where attention goes. And so we're going to continue going in that direction. And in that case, money's going to go down the drain. But if we change our focus into saying, where are all the opportunities in the moment? In other words, why could right now be the best time in the world for us to be in business? Everything starts to change. And we saw that in the travel industry. With one of our clients, literally his largest competitors worth hundreds of millions of dollars were going out of business in a matter of weeks. This guy couldn't even physically put people on a plane because international borders were closed, and he ran an international travel company. And yet what ended up happening was during the same time where nobody could put people on a plane, he broke every sales record, from most sales in a day, most sales in a week, most sales in a month, and had one of the best years ever. And that's because he found opportunity. Now, he still couldn't put people on a plane, but he would sell people packages that, would basically say, the moment borders open up again, you'll be first in line, or you'll be in line before everybody else. And we can take this extra time to plan it out, make it super special for you, and blah, blah, blah. It was phenomenal. So, and we had the same thing, a restaurateur who owns 4 restaurants in town, and he had the best time in the world. In fact, he said to me the other day, if he was given the option to do COVID all over again, he would do it in a heartbeat because he never had a better year. And I know some people obviously had difficult times, and I don't want to take anything away from that. COVID definitely impacted many people. But for those people, who had the mindset that there's opportunity that is available anywhere, they tended to have a bit more of an advantage.
I love your stories, Charlie. And we are at the end of our time for today. For people who want to understand how to get that mindset into their business so they can see every year as an opportunity, where's the best place to find you?
Predictableprofits.com. Again, that's predictableprofits.com.
Predictableprofits.com, folks. I love Charlie's work so much that I was once just giving a speech back before I had my own book. So I just bought an entire box of Charlie's books and put my business card in each book and handed those out. Talk about borrowed authority right there.
I appreciate you, my man.
Charles, thanks for being on the show. It's predictableprofits.com, Charles Gaudet, and all the social medias. And we'll talk to you again soon.
Thank you.